After 5 years of development, SRAM are ready to release their new Eagle AXS transmission. I went out to Tucson, Arizona to give it a ride. If you follow the World Cup cross-country race scene, you'll have seen Nino Schurter, one of their top riders, using the new electronic group set already. So it's no big secret that it's coming, but it's the first time any of us have been able to get our hands on it. While electronic group sets aren't anything new, of course we've seen ETAP from SRAM on the roadside, and Shimano have Di2 as well with XTR and XT. This is the first time we're seeing SRAM bring something out into the mountain bike side of things. Where the new Eagle AXS transmission differs from that of Shimano, as we've already sort of covered, is that it's completely wireless. So unlike Shimano, you don't need to find somewhere in your bike to store a battery, and there's no need to route the cables from the shifter to the mech. That means installation is far more straightforward. You simply need to bolt your mech on and your shifter on and pair the two together. Once that's done, it's just a 5-minute job just to get things shifting really nicely. All SRAM AXS components use their own wireless network to communicate with one another, which SRAM say is totally secure, so it means it can't be interfered with. They do also have Bluetooth and ANT+, should you want to connect them to your smartphone or your GPS head unit. The reason why you'd want to connect it to your smartphone is that SRAM do have an AXS app, which allows you to customize what the shifter can do, and you can see stuff like battery life for the components, as well as it gives you updates on mileage and things like when to oil your chain and stuff like that. A little bit more about the app. Just like you would when you're scanning to find anything that you want to sync your phone with, you will be able to pick up a number of different SRAM AXS components if you are, for example, at a race and a lot of people are using the equipment. But in order to pair it with your phone, you will actually need to be with the bike and pushing the access button while you sync it to the app. Otherwise, it won't work and you won't be able to customize anything. Equally, that means if you do want to interfere with someone else's bike, you will physically need to be with that bike and push the button should you want to potentially change how their shifter works. But hopefully it should be totally secure and we won't see any problems. Now, let's start with the shifter. Unlike Shimano's Di2, which uses a more conventional twin paddle shift, SRAM have gone down the route of using something a little bit different. They've actually gone for a shifter that uses 3 buttons. Now, the main paddle, if you want to call it that, is a cup shape like this, more or less, which pivots there in the middle. A button there, button there. So you can use the top of it to shift into harder gears and the bottom to shift into easier gears if you want, or using the app you can switch that functionality around. There's also a little trigger on the inside which you can use with your index finger, or depending on how you roll the shifter on your bar, you can potentially hit it with your thumb. As far as we're aware, Nino calls it the sprint button. So when he's up out the saddle and not covering his brakes, he can just bang through the gears quick. According to SRAM, it took at least 100 different variants on this shaping to actually get to where they wanted it to be. And in use, it actually does take quite a while to get used to, because unlike a regular shifter, there's no real throw. It is literally pushing a button. Now, they have changed how much force is required for those different buttons, and it really depends on what you feel is comfortable, how you want to roll the shifter on the bar, and what sort of riding you're doing, I think. But it's a case of taking a bit of time to get used to it. If, like me, you've ridden bikes for 25 years, it takes quite a while just to get your head around the fact that it's quite different. But it does come, and once you get to that point, it does feel quite intuitive. So another thing the app will let you do is adjust or customize how many shifts you want to make when you're holding down one button. So you can go 2, 3, or all the gears whilst holding it. It's easy to change, and I would say for me, it was something that took a little while to get used to, because of their shifting action is so light. There are times, especially when it's really rough and you're cranking up a really steep hill, where you'll hit the button and all of a sudden realize that you've skipped too many gears, or you need to shift back and make life easier for yourself. So again, definitely something that takes a bit of experimenting with and time to get used to. In terms of battery life, the shifter uses a CR2032, I think it is. So just a small penny-sized battery, which should, according to SRAM, last a good couple of years. Finally, I actually asked the guys at SRAM about the shape of the paddle and if there's going to be any alternatives launched to market, because after all, it's a small plastic paddle that can be injection molded, I think, which shouldn't cost too much. So they are potentially looking into alternatives. Equally, there's the potential to use something like Suguru, where you can mold the shifter to fit your thumb or finger that bit more easily. I think Nino has his altered slightly with a slight ridge on it in order to make shifting that bit easier. Obviously the shifter's only half the story here, and the rear mech is where a lot of the exciting stuff happens. It houses the battery and the motor, of course. Now originally, because SRAM already has ETAP on the market, they did actually start using the road technology to see how it could cross over and make a mountain bike mech, for example. But what they found they needed was a motor with more torque, and one which in this case spins at 80,000 RPM, with the road one spins at around about 50,000. The battery itself just clips onto the back of the mech, as you can see, and all you have to do is whip it off to charge it, and it's also interchangeable with the new Reverb AXS dropper post. So should you run low on one or the other, you can switch batteries to get you home. The mech has actually been canted round the frame a little more this time, which overall means there's more chain wrap around the cassette, which should help with load distribution and improve stuff like durability, longevity of the chain, cassette, things like that. It's also added 10mm more clearance over a mechanical Eagle mech. So hopefully that means it's going to lessen the chances of you clouting something in the trail. The new Eagle AXS mech features two clutches. The first is their Type 3 clutch, which is used across the vast majority of their mountain bike group sets, which is simply just to keep the chain in check, add a bit of tension there so it stops flapping around. The second one is the more exciting one and has a very, very important job in this application. The idea here is the new overload clutch, as SRAM call it, is to protect the geared motor. Now, what happens with this is should you whack a rock on the outside of the mech or a stick's come through and gets tangled in your wheel, knocking it either in or out, means the new overload clutch will disengage the motor and allow the mech to move whichever way it needs to in order to protect it, which is great because if you think about Shimano's mech, there wasn't any kind of system like this in place, and you could potentially write off a £400 mech. While I was out in Arizona, I did in fact cut a corner, smack a rock with the mech, and I honestly thought that, okay, that's my ride done. But within seconds you can hear it just right itself back to where it was last on the shift, and yeah, you know what, it worked for the rest of the day without a problem, even though there was a chunk of metal missing from the mech. In terms of battery life, SRAM claim they've been fairly conservative, saying it should last around about 25 hours of ride time. Unfortunately, I can't really comment on this because we didn't really ride anything more than 2 or 3 hours at a time. But that said, it's worth mentioning that the system will do everything it can to try and conserve battery by going into its sleep mode. So if you just rest the bike up against the wall or you're not riding it, it's not doing anything, so it's not draining the battery. And as soon as you move the bike or hit the shifter, it wakes up effectively. So just to ensure it doesn't turn on, if you are going to do, I don't know, a 6-hour drive to Scotland or drive all the way down to the Alps, it's probably worth popping the battery off the mech just to conserve power even more. If you're not too bothered about using the AXS app to check battery life constantly, then you do have an LED on the mech itself that you can use to keep tabs on exactly how much power is in there. Something really important with anything electrical on your bike is just how waterproof it is. SRAM claim that it should be totally fine, but as with anything on your bike that has seals or intricate moving parts, things like that, obviously they warn you to be careful when it comes to jet washing your bike. And again, that's something that we'll obviously look into when we do receive our test sample, but right now I can't really comment. In terms of weight, SRAM are actually claiming that you're going to save around about 5 grams over the mechanical equivalent. So that's XX1 Eagle versus XX1 Eagle AXS. That means ditching all the cables, even though you're replacing it with a battery and a motor, you're still actually making a weight saving, which is pretty impressive, I think. So with all that out of the way, what's it actually like to ride this new wireless transmission? Well, for me, as I said before, it does take a little bit of time to get used to the shifter shape and just how easy it is to shift. The first thing I had to do, rather than actually use the app to change what the buttons did, as I left it just in its default setting, was more about its position on the bar. I normally roll the shifter back towards me just so it's easier for me to reach with my thumb when I want to make shifts when I'm stood up out the saddle. But in this case, I found it most comfortable with the shifter actually rolled further round under the bar, which is unusual for me. As I already mentioned, the paddle is quite different to a traditional shifter, so it did take me a little while to get used to. And one of the more unusual things is just that there is no real throw because they are buttons, so you are just pushing a button. So again, that's just a case of you adapting to something that's quite new and something that you're just really not used to. But as I said before, after a little while, it became fairly intuitive. Once you're actually accustomed to how the shifter feels and works, it actually becomes really easy to use. And I found myself on the terrain we were riding particularly, where there was no real long uphill drags. Every little climb was quite technical and punchy and really rocky, shifting a hell of a lot. And even on trails I didn't really know, which meant I was doing quite a lot of shifting under load because I was coming into corners blind, not really knowing what was round the next bend. And even then, shifting always felt crisp and accurate. Of course, a big thing for me was how well that overload clutch worked when I did whack it. And it wasn't just me, another couple of journos did exactly the same. One was an even bigger hit, losing more metal from the mech, and it was so loud, I think a good few of us down the trail could even hear it. And his mech carried on working completely fine throughout the rest of the weekend that we were away for. So I think that's pretty impressive, and certainly something to take away is that if you are dumping this sort of money on kit like this, knowing that there are those fail-safes built in that should, hopefully, fingers crossed, save it. As I've already alluded to a few times already, the shifter action is really light, but the shifting itself is really fast, positive and crisp. And that's even under high loads when you're really cranking hard and trying to scrabble your way up an awkward climb. One thing I think is probably worth talking about is when you're using those much bigger sprockets and shifting up into that 50, for example, where it still seemed to be just as fast and less laboured maybe than a mechanical, I would say. That would be the best way to explain it. But again, with limited time on this, we need to spend a lot longer trying it in a lot more different situations. And obviously out in the desert in Arizona, it was nice and dry, with the biggest problem being dust. But over here in the UK, it's going to be subjected to a lot more grit and grime and mud for a lot longer. So that'll be the real test, and I can fill you in as to how that goes later down the year. Just like their other drivetrains, SRAM are selling the Eagle AXS drivetrain as a complete unit. That means shifter, chain, cassette, crank, rear mech as a whole. But fortunately in this case, the cassette and the crankset hasn't changed. That means you can potentially use existing parts that you already have, or potentially even cheaper parts. So, how much is this all going to cost? Well, SRAM are offering two different drivetrains. The first and most expensive is XX1 Eagle AXS, which is aimed more at the cross-country market, so it's slightly lighter, and it's going to cost you £1,950 or $2,000. Or there's the slightly more robust and marginally heavier X01 Eagle AXS transmission, which is going to cost £1,900 or $1,900. Obviously here, price is the sticking point, and with any new technology when it first comes out, it's always going to be pricey. And whether or not we'll see that trickle down, who knows? I think the big thing for SRAM here is that most of the cost is in the electronic parts and the motor, so whether they're able to make that cheaper or not, I'm not really sure. But regardless, if you're not willing to spend that extra cash and have that extra level of electrical integration on your bike, and you kind of want to stay away from that and stick with mechanical, then that's totally fine, because mechanical systems do a job really well. If I was to compare it to XTR Di2, which I spent a couple of years on back in 2014, 2015, then I would say this is definitely a move in the right direction. And the wireless system obviously means you don't have the worry of all those additional cables from XTR Di2, for example, or just your standard mechanical ones, which means setup time and maintenance is that bit easier. Overall then, I do think the new AXS drivetrain is a step in the right direction in terms of electronic group sets. SRAM have obviously got the advantage that they've gone second. Shimano have already had that system in place for some time, and the guys at SRAM were lucky enough to see where maybe the benefits or pitfalls might have been with certain different aspects of that, and they've been able to rectify that. So their system is that bit cleaner, crisper, easier to use. That includes the app as well, which is a bit less clunky than Shimano's version. And if you're like me and a bit of a technophobe or dinosaur when it comes to that sort of stuff, it just makes life that bit easier. So what do you guys think? Is SRAM's Eagle AXS group set a step in the right direction, or is it technology gone too far? As always, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe.